There is a word that Amish women learn before they learn to read. It is not written in any primer. It is not spoken aloud in any lesson. It lives in the way a mother's eyes drop when a father enters a room. It lives in the way a grandmother refolds her hands when she has said too much. The word is endure. I learned it at 4 years old, watching my mother's face. I spent 8 years of my marriage learning what it truly costs. My name is Hannah. I was married at 18 to a man named Joseph. And what I am about to tell you is the thing I have never said in one place all the way through, from beginning to end. Because the truth about what Amish husbands can do when a wife disobeys is not one thing. It is not a single moment. It is a system. And I lived inside that system for 8 years before I finally understood that endurance was not the same as survival. Before I go any further, I want to say something honest to you. More than 90% of the people watching this right now have not subscribed yet. And I understand that. You may have found this video by accident. You may not be sure yet if you want to stay. But if something in that first paragraph made your chest tighten, if something in the word endure felt familiar in a way you were not expecting, then I think you already know this story is for you. Please subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It is completely free, and it means the next story will find you instead of you having to search for it alone. And while you are here, I want to ask you something in the comments. What is the one thing you were taught to endure that you now know you should never have been asked to carry? Tell me when you are ready. I will be reading. I want to tell you about the first time I disobeyed. Not because it was dramatic. Not because what happened next was the worst thing that ever happened to me inside that marriage. I want to tell you about it because it was so small. That is the part that matters, the smallness of it. The thing I did that was considered disobedience in my community was this. I answered a question that had been directed at my husband. We were standing in the yard after Sunday service. A neighbor, an older man named Reuben, had asked about the condition of our east field after the wet spring we had. Joseph was standing 2 feet to my left, and I knew the answer because I had walked that field 3 days earlier, and Joseph had not. So I answered. I said the drainage was holding, but the northeast corner would need attention before planting. Reuben nodded. Joseph said nothing. But I felt it. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. That particular stillness that meant I had done something I would hear about later. We rode home in the buggy in silence, the kind of silence that has weight. Our daughter, who was 3 years old and sitting between us, fell asleep against my arm. And I remember looking at her small face and thinking, she does not know yet. She does not know that there is a way a man's silence can be louder than anything he could say out loud. That night, after she was in bed, Joseph sat at the kitchen table and did not look at me while I cleaned up after supper. And when I finally sat down across from him, he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very even, "You embarrassed me today." That was all he said. You embarrassed me today. And I said I was sorry, and I meant it. That is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who did not grow up where I grew up. I meant it. I had been taught so thoroughly that speaking out of turn was a failure of character that I sat across from a man who had not walked his own field, and I apologized for knowing what he did not know. That is where it begins, not with the loud things, with the quiet ones. There is something I need you to understand about the word disobedience in an old order Amish community before I tell you the rest. Because when people outside the community hear that word, they imagine something dramatic. A woman who refuses to cook, a woman who argues in public, a woman who challenges her husband's decisions in front of others. Those things happen too. But disobedience inside my marriage covered a territory so wide I could not always see its edges. Disobedience was speaking before being spoken to in certain company. Disobedience was having an opinion about money when money had not been offered as a topic. Disobedience was taking too long in the garden when the house needed something. Disobedience was crying in a way that made Joseph uncomfortable. Disobedience was not crying when the community expected visible grief. Disobedience was reading after he had gone to bed. Disobedience was asking why. That last one, that was the one that cost me the most. I am a person who has always needed to understand the reason behind a thing. Not to argue, not to rebel, simply because my mind does not rest until it can see the shape of something clearly. And in my marriage to Joseph, why was the most dangerous word in my vocabulary. The first time I asked why in a way that crossed a line I had not known was there, we had been married for about 14 months. He had decided, without telling me, that we would not be attending his cousin's wedding in the neighboring district. I had been looking forward to it. I had been planning what we would bring. I found out the morning we were meant to leave when he came in for breakfast already dressed for fieldwork instead of church clothes. And I asked why we were not going. Not loudly, not with anger, simply why. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said it was not my concern. And I made the mistake of saying, quietly, that I thought it was, because I had already told his cousin's mother we would be there. That was the first time I understood that there was a version of Joseph I had not met during our brief courtship. He did not raise his hand. I want to be clear about that because I know that is what people expect to hear. He did not raise his hand that morning. What he did was something that left no mark anyone could see. He left the house. He did not come back until supper. He did not speak to me for 4 days. Not one word. Not to answer a direct question, not to acknowledge that I had spoken. He moved through our home as though I were a piece of furniture that had been placed in a slightly wrong position. And on the 4th day, he came to breakfast, sat down, and said good morning in his normal voice. And that was it. It was over. Except that it was never over. Because I had learned something in those 4 days that I carried for the next 7 years. I had learned that the silence was the punishment, and that the punishment had no announced end date. I never knew, each time it came, how long it would last. 3 days, 8 days, once 11 days. I lived in that uncertainty the way you live inside bad weather, never sure when it would lift, always adjusting myself to survive it. I want to stop here and ask you something, because I think some of you listening right now have known a version of this silence. Not necessarily inside an Amish marriage, not necessarily inside a religious community, but that specific silence, the one used as a tool, the one that says, "You have displeased me, and I will make you feel my displeasure until I decide you have felt it enough." If you know that silence, I want you to hear me say this clearly. That silence has a name, and the name is not discipline. The name is not headship. The name is not godly correction. I learned those words later, in English, when I was outside the community and sitting across from a counselor who handed me a piece of paper with a list on it. The name on that list was control. I am going to keep telling you this story, but I needed to say that first. There is a structure inside old order Amish life that most people on the outside do not fully see. And I did not fully see it myself until I was inside it and the door had closed behind me. The structure is this. A wife who is considered disobedient has several layers of consequence available to her husband, And every single one of those layers is sanctioned by the community, blessed by the church, and reinforced by every woman she knows. The first layer is private correction. That is the silence. That is the withdrawn warmth. That is the husband who speaks to you only about necessary things for days at a time, until you have demonstrated sufficient regret. The second layer is what I can only describe as management. This is when a husband begins making decisions that restrict your movement without announcing that restriction directly. Joseph started doing this in our 3rd year. He began needing the buggy on days when I had planned to visit my mother. He began mentioning, casually, that a particular neighbor's wife was not a good influence, which meant I was not to spend time with her, though he never said it that plainly. He began accompanying me to places I had previously gone alone, not because he wanted to be there, I could see that plainly, but because my going alone had become, in his mind, a freedom that required supervision. The third layer is community involvement. This is the one that took my breath away the first time it happened. Because I had thought, in whatever small part of me still believed in the possibility of an ally, that there was somewhere I could go. That if things became too much, I could speak to someone, a deacon's wife, an older woman I trusted. I learned in our 4th year of marriage that this was not the case. I had said something to an older woman in our district, not much, only that I was struggling, only that I was finding marriage harder than I had expected. I did not describe the silences. I did not use any word that would have sounded alarming. I only said I was struggling. Within 2 weeks, Joseph came home one evening and told me, again in that quiet, even voice, that he had spoken with the deacon. That the deacon had reminded him it was his responsibility to provide firm guidance for a young wife who was having difficulty submitting. And that the deacon had also spoken with me personally the following Sunday, pulling me aside after service to tell me, with great gentleness, that a wife's struggle was usually a sign that she had not yet fully surrendered her own will to God. He smiled when he said it. He meant it kindly. I understood in that moment that the structure had no exits I had not already seen. Every door opened back into the same room. I stayed for 4 more years after that Sunday. I want to be honest about why, because I think people expect the answer to be fear. And fear was part of it, but it was not the whole of it. The larger part was something harder to name. It was the weight of everything I would lose. My children, and by our 5th year I had 2, a daughter and a son. My mother, who was aging and who I could not imagine leaving. My language, my way of moving through a day, the smell of my own kitchen, the particular quality of light through the window above the sink on a winter morning. I had built a life inside that marriage, even while the marriage was diminishing me. And the life and the diminishment were not separate things. They were woven together so completely that I could not see how to pull one thread without unraveling everything. This is something I did not understand until I was out. That the entrapment was not only external. It was not only the structure of the church and the community and the authority of a husband's word over a wife's voice. The entrapment was also the tenderness I felt for my own life, for the small dignities I had managed to keep, for the moments that were genuinely good, because there were good moments. Joseph was not only the silence and the control. He was also the man who had once spent an entire cold afternoon helping our daughter build a proper shelter for her cat because she had cried when the cat came in shivering. People are not one thing. That is the part that makes this kind of story difficult to tell cleanly. He was not only one thing. And because he was not only one thing, leaving felt like destroying something that was not entirely broken. It took me 8 years to understand that something does not have to be entirely broken to be wrong for you. It took me 8 years to understand that I was allowed to want a life in which I did not monitor my own voice before I spoke. A life in which a question was only a question and not a provocation. A life in which the air did not change when I entered a room holding an opinion. The morning I left, it was raining. Our children were at school. Joseph was in the barn. I had a bag I had packed over 3 weeks, a little at a time, so nothing would be noticed missing. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the window above the sink. The light was gray because of the rain, and I said goodbye to it in my mind. I said goodbye to the kitchen and the window and the particular way mornings felt in that house before the day required anything of me. Then I picked up the bag and I walked to the road, and I did not look back, because I knew if I looked back, I would not be able to keep walking. I have thought about that walk every day since, not with regret, with something more complicated than regret, with the understanding that surviving a thing and grieving a thing are not opposites. You can grieve the life you had to leave in order to survive it. That grief does not mean you were wrong to go. It means you were human enough to love something even while it was hurting you. If you are somewhere right now, inside a silence that has no announced end date, I want to say something to you directly. The silence is not correction. The silence is not love expressing itself in a different language. The silence is a door being held shut. And you are allowed to look for another door. You are not faithless for wanting to breathe. You are not disobedient for needing a life in which your voice is not a risk you calculate before you use it. You were not made to endure. You were made to live. And those two things are not the same. I know because I spent 8 years confusing them. I know because I stood in a kitchen saying goodbye to a window, and I thought I was losing everything. I did not know yet that I was only losing the walls. Before you go, I want to thank you for staying with me all the way to this moment. I know there were 100 places you could have gone today, and you chose to stay here until the end. And that means something to me that I cannot fully put into words. I have noticed that more than 90% of the people who watch these videos still have not subscribed. And I understand it. But if this story gave you something, if it named something you had not been able to name, if it sat beside you in the way you needed something to sit beside you today, then please subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It is free. It keeps these stories alive. It means the next woman who needs to hear this will be able to find it. And before you go, tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you longest. Tell me if you recognized the silence. Tell me if you have ever stood in a kitchen saying goodbye to a window. I will be reading every word. Until next time, remember this. The voice inside you that kept asking why was never the problem. It was always the most honest thing in the room.